So welcome everybody to the fourth lunch talk in the series Transport After COVID-19. And today we have the honor to invite Ms. Hanah Hook from Ghent University, who will talk more about more time for undirected travel implications for post-pandemic travel and mobility. Before I will pass the floor to Hanah, I want to highlight that next week there will be the biannual conference, the BIVEC-GIBET Transport Research Days 2021, which will be organized online. And the entire program can be downloaded from our website. And note that there is also a coffee tea corner room for attending and having fruitful informal discussions between the formal sessions. So please also have a look at that coffee tea corner during the BIVEC-GIBET conference. So as a reminder, this is our website. I guess most found your way through the website. So next week there is the BIVEC-GIBET Transport Research Days. So if you didn't notice it down in your agenda yet, you can still participate at the conference. So feel free to join one of the many interesting sessions that will be held next week. I also want to already advertise the next lunch talk which will be held on June 4th by Dr. Franse from VUB, who will talk about social exclusion related to COVID-19. With no further delay, I'm now happy to pass the floor to Ms. Hook.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Mario, for the introduction. I'm happy to be here to talk a little bit about undirected travel and some of the travel behavior differences that we've seen since the pandemic and the lockdowns. So just for a bit of background for those who don't know me, I'm a second-year PhD student at Ghent University, and I look into travel satisfaction and subjective well-being. So this is the relationships between these two is either top-down in that those who are more generally happy with their lives are more likely to rate their travel as more satisfying, or in the opposite direction, possibly those who have better travel, like for example, if your commute is maybe shorter, it's really pretty, you like it, it might in turn affect your well-being overall and your happiness. So an important aspect to travel behavior in general and travel satisfaction is this concept of undirected travel. And I'll get into a more specific definition in a little bit, but it's important because it has different aspects than directed travel trips, like a commuting or a shopping trip. And generally, these trips are undertaken for satisfaction itself. So understanding undirected travel trips can be important to understanding travel satisfaction. And thus far, there's not a lot of research that's been done about undirected travel. So first, I'll talk slightly about what we know about directed travel trips. So these are your normal everyday trips, your commuting trips, shopping trips, leisure trips like going bowling, going to a restaurant, maybe going to the seaside or to a museum or something. We know quite a bit about these trips. For example, we know that those who travel by bicycle are more often more satisfied with their trips. Those who travel by public transportation and specifically by bus are typically less satisfied. There's a general desire to minimize travel time for these trips, even though not to a complete zero, because that buffer between destinations is valuable still. And those who travel, who have activity participation during travel, such as reading a book while you're on the train, listening to music, talking to somebody, enjoying the scenery, those trips are often more satisfying. And finally, those who travel with other people typically have more satisfying trips. But because the main goal of these trips are just to reach the destination, they could have completely different implications for satisfaction outcomes than undirected trips. So undirected trips are these trips that are taken without a destination or where the destination is ancillary to the travel. So the sole purpose of these trips is to partake in the trip itself or to travel for the sake of traveling. And often These trips are undertaken with active modes, so going on a walk, going bicycling, going jogging, but they can also be undertaken with motorized modes, such as going for a joyride by car, going to take the tram along the coast, just going on a motorcycle trip, going boating, or even more extreme sports like skydiving or snowboarding. Those could be undirected travel trips, or even airplane flights to nowhere, such as the Qantas flight that they've started offering flights during the lockdown for maybe those who are missing the active traveling, or even the more recent one to see the supermoon and to get a little bit closer and enjoy the scenery on your airplane undirected travel. So though they are often active trips, physical activity is not a requirement of undirected trips, but instead that they are undertaken without a destination or where the destination is ancillary to the travel. And this could also include instances of trip linking or trip extension, where maybe you're on a walk and you pass by the supermarket and you say, oh, I forgot I have to go in there. Or if you go to a supermarket that's further away than the one that you normally would, just because you want to take the walk. And these trips have thus far typically been categorized as leisure trips in most of the research. And because of that, it's possible that the share of undirected trips is underestimated. And there's an important difference between leisure trips and undirected trips. So for example, if you're on the way to meet your friends for dinner, that's a leisure trip, but maybe you're stuck in traffic and maybe you're running late and maybe you're really stressed out. So you would have lower satisfaction potentially with that trip than you would with an undirected trip, which is generally just taken for the purpose of satisfaction itself. Further, it could be argued that if you go on a walk, your destination is to get back home, or if you go skydiving, your destination is the ground. But the difference lies in that these trips are taken with the goal of the travel itself, not the goal of arriving at a destination. And so to come to the lockdown, even though I was, for my PhD research, already thinking about these undirected trips and what they mean to travel satisfaction, the lockdown presented a really unique situation to investigate not only what motivates people to take undirected travel trips or how satisfied they are with them, but also to look at how people move and where they go when the destinations are removed. And then also to look at whether there was any compensation for a reduction in directed trips with undirected trips, and generally if lockdown stimulated undirected travel. And I'm sure, as most of you know, the lockdown was really quite strict in Belgium because we had such a high death rate, the first lockdown at least, such a high death rate, and population density is pretty high as well. So all unnecessary destinations were closed. You weren't even allowed to stop and have a chat. You had to keep moving while you were on your walk or your jog. Teleworking and telestudying was mandatory unless it was not possible. And public transit was reduced. So a lot of people seemed to be turning to these undirected walks or bike rides just for a chance to clear their head, to get out of the house, or even to meet friends and go on a walk. You could technically be with one other person. They were supposed to be under the same roof. I'm not sure how many people actually followed that rule. But we noticed that a lot of this was happening during lockdown. And then we also noticed that a lot of travel behavior studies were coming out. There were surveys going crazy about lockdown travel behavior. So we wanted to find a way to look at this a little bit differently and see what maybe was interesting, because I think, at least for me, it wasn't that interesting to report that directed travel reduced during lockdown. I think everyone saw that in their cities all over the world. So we were looking for sort of another layer to a travel behavior study by asking, if all of these destinations are closed and if people are still out and moving around and still walking and still cycling, does this mean that there's more evidence for a positive utility of travel? And maybe does it indicate that there is a need for travel outside of just getting from point A to point B? So the undirected travel trips are important to understand for a number of reasons. First of all, it's important to the positive utility of travel and understanding whether a travel time budget might exist or if there is compensatory behavior. So this challenges the idea that travel is a derived demand, and it instead suggests that there are aspects of travel itself that people enjoy, such as a sense of speed or movement or stretching or getting out and clearing your head. And then also the idea of a travel time budget. So maybe there is a certain amount of travel that people want to participate in, and normally maybe their directed trips, like their commute or their shopping trips, meet or exceed this travel time budget in some cases. But during lockdown, maybe undirected travel is an opportunity to compensate for those missing trips. Next, it's undirected travel might be important to maintaining physical and mental health and well-being. And this is especially important during times of lockdown when maybe some of those other outlets weren't available anymore. Lockdown travel behavior might persist after the pandemic. So De Haas and colleagues in the Netherlands last year found that many people started participating in these undirected travel trips during lockdown, and 20% of them expect to maintain this behavior after the lockdown, which is pretty substantial. And finally, as most of undirected travel trips, I think for this study, it was 95.5% undertaken with active modes. Understanding undirected travel can have implications for both health goals and sustainability goals for trying to have people moving toward active modes instead of motorized modes. So a little bit about the methodology. The online survey was open and circulated from the 20th of April to the 4th of May, 2020. So for 2 weeks, we employed a convenience sampling method just because at the time we didn't know how long the lockdown was going to last. And so we really just wanted to reach as many people as possible in a short amount of time. So 41 municipality groups in Facebook community groups for 41 municipalities were targeted in the Ghent and Antwerp regions. And we had an original 1,041 respondents, but 764 gave their address data, which we used for geocoding. So this was important because the link between travel and the built environment can affect access to travel modes, travel distance, time traveled, or traffic congestion. And the residential characteristics like proximity to businesses or living outside of a cul-de-sac or the aesthetics even of a neighborhood can stimulate undirected travel. So the idea here was that individuals in different levels of urbanization might experience differences in travel behavior and specifically in undirected travel during the lockdown. So for example, someone in a rural residential area might really value open space and nature. And so if their commute is removed, they might rely on undirected travel to have that experience. Or on the other hand, if someone lives in an urban setting, they might value the ease of socialization and therefore might start taking undirected trips as a way to meet their friends when they couldn't, go to a restaurant or something like that. And then this is just a quick methodology of the geospatial analysis. So this wasn't used for this picture wasn't from this study, but it's the same methodology that I used in a previous study. So by geocoding the addresses, we were able to create street network buffers around participant homes and then calculate the amount of transit stops, the amount of intersections within those buffers, and then the residential density of the plots that intersected the buffers and the land use mix of the plots that intersected the buffers. And this follows methodology from the International Physical Activity and the Environment Network, as well as incorporates Cervero's 5Ds. And that created an urban score as a demographic information. So regarding the demographics of the sample, the average age was about 46%, 75% of respondents were females, which was really quite high for Flanders. I think it's a maybe 51 or 52% split normally. And at first I attributed it to just the convenience sampling method. So maybe women are more often on Facebook, or maybe women are more likely to be members of these Facebook community groups. But Veronique van Acker, who is also a co-author and she presented at the last lunch session, found similar results regarding the female response rate in Luxembourg, and she was using a more sophisticated sampling technique. So I thought that was a really interesting coincidence. So maybe we should look into why women are responding to COVID travel behavior surveys a little bit more. 72% of the participants were employed or studying. 68% were university educated, which is also elevated for Flanders. And then after calculating that urban score from the previous slide, the average was 7.1 out of a range of 0 to 12, so also a slightly elevated level of urbanization. And then regarding trip characteristics, we looked, excuse me, at mode, frequency, distance, and duration of undirected travel trips. So as you can see, there are a few extra mode categories. Those who took only an undirected trip, walking, cycling, jogging, or other, were in these first 4 categories, but participants could respond to multiple modes. So if they took a recent walk and a recent cycle trip, they were able to respond for both of those. So about 45% of people took 2 different modes for undirected trips, and 21% took 3 or more modes. And then this other category, that 1% is mostly made up of car trips. About 30% are not car trips. Regarding frequency, 21% took less than 1 undirected trip per week. 1/3 of people took 1 to 3 undirected trips per week. And about 50% took 4 or more undirected trips per week, which is pretty interesting given the normal amount of commuting and shopping trips. This is maybe higher than expected. So people really were using undirected travel a lot of the time. And then regarding the duration, the average duration was 71 minutes, and that, excuse me, is very high compared to what we know about directed trips. The average commuting trip in Flanders is 28 minutes. So this is a theme that will return throughout the presentation, but the longer average duration of undirected trips is something that's very distinct from what we know about directed trips. And then the average distance was 11 kilometers, which is really difficult to pull any sort of conclusion from because this included all different modes, so both motorized and active modes. So yeah, obviously differences there. So the first the first thing that we looked at as far as empirically understanding undirected travel trips were motivations. So I'll talk about motivations of undirected trips, satisfaction with them, and then finally I'll get to what actually happened during the lockdown with travel behavior. So quickly regarding the motivations, I won't get too into it. If you're interested, I'll be talking about them more in depth next week at the BIVEC conference. So we did a factor analysis for over 24 questions regarding what people valued about undirected trips or what they liked about them. So the first, and it was a 4-factor solution, excuse me. So the first factor that we found was improving health and well-being. And this consisted of high factor scores on questions such as undirected travel trips are good for me. They improve well-being, they improve mental health, they're a good source of physical activity, they give me moving or stretching. The second factor that was found was removing negative feelings, and those consisted of high factor scores on questions like undirected trips relieve anger and hostility, they relieve tension and fear, they give me a sense of control, they reduce boredom, that type of thing. The third factor was enjoying scenery. So these were high factor scores on questions like admiring nature, discovering the environment, admiring the landscape. And finally, out-of-home socialization was the fourth factor with high factor scores on questions like seeing other people is valuable about undirected trips or social interaction is valuable. And then we did some mean comparison tests regarding these 4 factors and mode, frequency, distance, and duration. So first, as you can see, the other category was the least likely, so people only taking one type of undirected trip falling in this other category was least likely to fulfill the motivation of improving health and well-being. But you can also see that any single mode, with the exception of jogging, so walking by itself, cycling by itself, or other trips by themselves were less likely to fulfill improving health and well-being than two modes or even more, even more fulfilling three or more different modes. And this finding was echoed across all of the four motivations for travel, though jogging alone was not significantly less or more likely than using two or more modes or two or more modes to fulfill any motivation. And it seemed as though walking alone was more likely to fulfill all four motivations than cycling alone. Regarding frequency, as frequency of undirected trips increased, improving health and well-being was more likely to be fulfilled. And this again was pretty clearly echoed across all four of the motivations. So the frequency of undirected trips was pretty clearly important to motivations, fulfilling motivations for undirected trips. With distance and duration, again, I'll echo that increasingly longer duration was important to improving health and well-being as well as distance. Similarly, we saw this for all four of the motivations. And again, this is interesting because, you know, typically directed trips are more about minimizing the travel time instead of making these trips longer and fulfilling motivations with longer trips. And that brings me to undirected travel satisfaction. So what we found empirically about these undirected trips was measured by Edema's satisfaction with travel scale. So that asks participants to rank their satisfaction with travel on both emotional and evaluation components. So for example, the emotional components are things like, I was stressed or calm in my last trip, during my last trip, I was tired or alert, I was worried about being late, I was at ease, I was bored, or I was enthusiastic. And then the evaluation components actually ask them to evaluate their trip. So it was the worst trip I can think of, it was the best trip I can think of, it was high or low standard, it worked well or it worked poorly. So regarding the most recent trip, we looked at walkers, cyclers, joggers, and car users. And similarly to what we know about directed trips, cyclists looked like they had the highest satisfaction with undirected trips. To my knowledge, this is the first study that evaluates satisfaction with jogging trips, but those were also quite high. Whereas the less physically intense modes of walking and car use were found to be less satisfying, though definitely car use was less satisfying than walking for our undirected trips. And then regardless of mode, looking again at distance and duration, we can see that satisfaction increased as duration and distance increased for both the emotion and the evaluation components, and again echoes a very obvious difference between undirected and directed trips. And then finally, regarding the four motivations and the satisfaction with travel scale. So removing negative feelings, trips that were higher on the satisfaction scale were more likely to fulfill removing negative feelings, followed by improving health and well-being, enjoying scenery, and out-of-home socialization. And the lower scores on the out-of-home socialization leads us to think that maybe undirected trips are more about fulfilling personal goals or like removing negative feelings than they are about necessarily meeting people. If you want to meet someone, typically maybe you'll have a different way to do that than going on a walk with them or going on a bicycle ride with them. So what we know about undirected travel satisfaction, the levels of satisfaction were found to be much higher than what we know about directed trips. And this was true of all trips, not just for commute, but also for what we know about leisure trips, which again reiterates that it is important to separate undirected trips from that leisure trip categorization. Longer, more frequent, and more active undirected trips using more than one mode are more satisfying and more likely to fulfill all motivations for taking undirected trips. And finally, satisfaction with undirected travel was found to have a clear positive relationship with well-being and physical and mental health. So these were measured by Denier's flourishing scale and the scale of positive and negative experience. So now that we have some empirical baseline information about undirected travel, we can look into what actually happened to travel behavior during the COVID lockdown, or the first COVID lockdown. So by evaluating how surveyed individuals changed their travel behavior in terms of mode for walkers, cyclers, car users, and public transit users, this research investigated whether a reduction in directed trips for commuting or non-work trips due to lockdown regulations stimulated an increase in undirected travel trips. So to start off with, as expected, many reported increased cycling and walking, though many also decreased or this behavior or the behavior remained the same. Most people reported a decrease in car and public transit use, though I'll shortly draw your attention to this 31% of public transit users that did not change their travel behavior, because this could indicate some sort of travel captivity. So Pawar and colleagues in India found similar results last year and noted that though a person's attitude toward the pandemic might favor avoiding public transit, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are in a situation where that's possible to switch to a different mode or where it's easy to switch to a different mode. And this isn't the only category, life category that has found inequities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So the regression analyses regarding directed travel behavior change showed that active modes, so walkers and cyclers, reduced their their directed trips for commuting and for non-work. There was a switch from car users to walking for commute, but there was also a slight shift from walkers to car use for commute. And as well, there was a slight shift from cyclers to public transit users for non-work modes. So these last two shifts from walking to car and from cycling to public transit were kind of surprising, but it could just be the result of some sort of latent demand, where as it became easier to use the car in public transit because there wasn't as much traffic or the transit cars weren't as full, maybe these people were taking advantage of that and switching so they didn't have to sit in traffic anymore. And there was not a shift seen from public modes to private modes. And this lack of shift, especially for the commuting directed travel behavior, could just be explained by the job functions of public transit users. Maybe those jobs were not functional during lockdown, so there was just a decrease in commuting trips in general. Or it could echo this travel inequity or travel captivity if those public transit users didn't have any other options. And regarding the undirected travel behavior change, 18% of people who did not report taking undirected trips before lockdown began doing so during lockdown. 11% of people who said they did not take, or they did take undirected trips before stopped doing so during lockdown, and then 71% didn't change their travel behavior. And regarding the regression analyses for undirected travel trips, those who participated in at least weekly undirected trips were more likely to have a decrease in car use. Those with positive attitudes toward walking and cycling were more likely to participate in weekly undirected travel. And those who participated in undirected travel before lockdown were more likely to participate in it during lockdown, which is not all that surprising, I think. So in sum, we saw that directed travel trips, regardless of mode, decreased. Evidence for both a shift from directed to undirected trips and from private motorized modes to active modes was seen, and this suggests some compensatory behavior. So this type of compensation activity suggests that there could indeed be a need for travel itself, and is contrary to the idea that travel is only ancillary to destinations, which is important for fields interested in promoting active travel for public health or sustainability policymaking, because it indicates that people who normally drive might switch to active modes when they have more time to do so. Travel attitudes and attitudes toward the pandemic were indicative of travel behavior, and it seems that having some sort of walking experience was important for those who took at least weekly walking undirected trips. And perhaps some of these people have rediscovered undirected travel during the lockdown. And then again, no evidence of a shift from public to private modes during lockdown indicates that public transit users might have no other option, and it could be interesting to travel behavior research as an example of captive traveling or transportation inequity. So a few opportunities for future research. Certainly investigation of undirected travel during a normal time period is interesting to find out, are undirected trips valuable when the destinations are available again, and for whom? Does normal commuting or shopping or recreation trips complete a person's travel time budget and then making the undirected travel no longer necessary? Or possibly will normal commuting change post-COVID with teleworking or flexible schedules making undirected trips maybe more prominent? And also there could be seasonal differences. So the survey was completed when it was really beautiful weather outside. So I would guess that maybe a midwinter survey might not find as obvious compensation behavior. And we have already conducted a follow-up survey for these participants, asking whether or not things have changed, but this was completed before the HoReCa sector reopened. And that was with the idea that maybe at the beginning of lockdown, it was more, or maybe at the beginning of the first lockdown, it was more, oh, I have all this extra time, maybe I can go take a walk, or maybe I can do this. Whereas a year later, when we're still in lockdown, maybe people aren't as excited about these undirected trips as they were before. Another opportunity for future research, definitely the idea and consequences of travel captivity need to be further explored. Other outputs from COVID surveys regarding travel behavior have brought up the inequalities that exist and are exacerbated by times of crisis. So those respondents who might have a fear of the virus or attitudes that reflect wanting to avoid public transit but aren't in a situation where they can need to be accounted for. And this is maybe not as important in Flanders, where, I mean, compared to a global scale, travel is pretty equitable. So this is maybe more interesting in places that have more inequalities regarding travel. Though we didn't see a connection in this study, the link between the built environment and undirected travel is still important, and this could also have to do with the location where we're looking at it. Flanders has a pretty high population density as it is, so looking at undirected travel and the differences between urban and rural undirected travel in places that are that have bigger differences, like maybe North America, for example, that could show some differences where Flanders maybe isn't as diverse enough. And then, yeah, of course, the convenience sampling method can be corrected, and maybe looking at a sample that's more representative of the population. And finally, I would like to find a way to spatially analyze these trips. It's a challenge because, at least a challenge compared to directed trips, because, for example, you can ask someone their home location and their work location, and you can, maybe you're not exactly correct on the route that they take, but you can more or less define the different route options that they have. Whereas undirected travel trips aren't like that, because you can go anywhere and it's for a longer period of time. So even some people talk about the shared city bikes, how sometimes they have GPS trackers on them. You would have to have some sort of prompt at the beginning to ask people where they're going, which is difficult. And I don't think that there's really a database that would already exist for this. So that's a challenge to spatially analyze undirected trips. And finally, I'll get to some opportunities for practical application. As more information is coming out about teleworking and more companies are thinking that maybe this is something they'll implement post-pandemic, maybe some of these ideas can inform employers and shape flexible schedule policies that include opportunities for undirected travel. Regarding urban planning, it's possible that undirected trips are being undervalued in cost-benefit analysis. So by understanding that satisfaction with undirected trips is higher and that these trips are longer in duration, perhaps some timeshare of trips can be accurately valued. And this could lead, for example, to resources being allocated to a new bike path instead of a new highway lane. Again, back to the differences between rural and urban, encouraging UT or undirected travel and resources being allocated to infrastructure that encourages undirected travel should be happening both in cities and both in rural and also in rural areas. And again, I'll reiterate that hopefully we don't have to start planning for the next pandemic or the next crisis soon, but paying attention to these travel inequities that have been exacerbated and implementing more equitable crisis planning is something that maybe can come out of the pandemic. And I'll quickly thank my co-authors, Jonas de Vos, Veronique van Acker, and Frank Whitlock. And I guess I'll pass it back to Mario and maybe questions.
Thank you for your nice presentation. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand if you have some questions. Myself, I will start with one question which relates to the travel budget that you cite. Do we have to consider undirected travel and their travel time really as a travel part of travel time, or is it more like an activity participation time if you consider it in the notion of a travel time budget?
Yeah, that is a question, isn't it? So yeah, Mokhtarian is, and I can't remember which other colleague came up with this idea of the travel time budget. So I think that is a really good question that needs to be kind of, yeah, you really have to make these distinctions because maybe the travel time budget is just these necessary trips that you have to go shopping, you have to do, you know, go to work, whatever. But the idea that when these trips are reduced, people are maybe making up for them with undirected travel could suggest that there is a certain amount of travel that we innately want to participate in. So that could be evidence for the budget, but I'm not really sure yet.
Maybe a related question to that is, you classify clearly trips as directed or undirected. To what extent is a portion of the undirected trips directed, or vice versa? Did you have a look at those specifications?
No,
for instance, if you go walk, or if you go to the shop but you take a detour, you gave the example before. Yeah.
So that's a classification that, yeah, I didn't look into it, and I'm not sure that it's such a new. It's not new, but it hasn't really been talked about very much. So those distinctions, I think, are things that maybe will come out as these definitions are more hardened.
I see a hand from Isabelle Thomas.
Yes, sorry, I was late, so I missed the beginning of your talk because I was stuck in another meeting. So could you just tell me, it's a Facebook sample?
Yeah.
Is it spatially representative, and of what? Because I think there's a big diversity. I couldn't recognize myself very well in my area about your results. So how far is your sample representative?
Yeah, so that's the main limitation of the study, is that it's not, so women are 75% of respondents, which is not representative by any means, and a little bit highly educated and maybe more retired people than the normal Flanders sample.
Shouldn't you correct it then?
So a weighted gender variable was used, but yeah, regarding the other, it was maybe not as big of an issue, I think, for the highly educated people, because it wasn't that different. And then for the I didn't talk about it in the study, but we talked in the paper about the retired individuals finding that they were more likely to participate in undirected trip.
And spatially? Geographically, where are they located?
Oh yeah, I didn't get that. I looked into it at the beginning, and then yeah, not much was found from from spatial analysis, so I didn't look as far into it.
You didn't look, or you don't have the information?
No, I have the for what about 70% of participants, I have their addresses. So I do have the information and I have it.
Because I think within cities, it might be very different than out of the cities. And in a big city, it might be very different from a small city. So this was always behind my mind when I was listening to you. That's it.
Yeah, and I had exactly the same thought, and that was really one of the drivers for me. But also, like I said, I think maybe Flanders isn't the best place to get those distinctions between a big city, a small city, and a really rural place. Whereas maybe, yeah, I don't know, in North America, where you can really be in the middle of nowhere, you can't really get in the middle of nowhere in Flanders.
But there are subtle differences.
Indeed, absolutely.
Thank you. I see a question from Susha.
Yes, thank you for the interesting talk. I have a question regarding the methodology part. Like, can you give a little bit more explanation regarding urban score? Because when you show presentation, you have the urban score and then based on the demographic information. So what would it be possible to look like when the urban score is lower or the urban score is higher, and then the related demographic information, what would it look like, for example?
So because the interest was in the undirected trips, I didn't really look at the differences in demographics regarding different levels of urbanization. Urbanization was just used as a covariate to kind of try to account for differences in where they live. So I'm not really sure what the differences in demographics are across urbanization levels.
Okay, so how to understand your urban score at 7.2 and then the related participants information? How to understand this part?
So the urbanization score was measured from built environment characteristics around their home location, and that was so all of the different factors were z-scored relative to the sample, and then summed to create this urbanization score. So it's relative to everyone who was participating in the study. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see a question from Tu.
Yep. Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask about the EFA method. I saw the results from your factor that you have 4 benefits for the undirected trip, like improving health and well-being, and removing negative feeling. And the cyclists seem to have very low scores on that. But on the next slide, so cyclists can have high scores on emotional. So what is can you explain so why that happened?
Oh, the satisfaction regarding. Okay, I see. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think that removing negative feelings is maybe the so because that was maybe the strongest for the emotion and the satisfaction, people were maybe more often happier when they were able to remove their negative feelings by using these undirected trips, whereas the out-of-home socialization maybe indicates that people aren't necessarily using trips for out-of-home socialization, and if they are, they're less satisfied with it because they're not getting the actual out-of-home socialization experience that they would in a normal situation and not in a lockdown situation. So the trips maybe aren't fulfilling that satisfaction that they are looking for from out-of-home socialization.
Also for the combined travel mode, so for those who use 2 or 3 more different travel modes, so do you have any differentiate? So what the difference between those combination? Like if they use walking and jogging at the same time, is that different than to walking with cycling?
No, yeah. So they were asked to report on their most recent undirected walk or their most recent undirected cycle and their most recent undirected jog. but some people didn't have more than one. They only had a walk, but some people had all three types of undirected trips, but they were all for different, all responding for different types of different trips. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? In the meanwhile, I have still one question related to the fact that the findings for your 4 different dimensions that came out of your factor analysis, if you look at how the scores of for instance, modal shares, but it's also in the other results that you had, they all seem to have similar findings across the 4 dimensions, which I found striking. The order of magnitude was I think in almost all similar for the 4 dimensions that you had. Is there any explanation why this is particularly the case?
Yeah, we had the same thought. I'm not sure. I can only speculate, but it just seems that the amount of undirected travel that people participate in equates to fulfilling these motivations regardless of what the motivation is.
Okay, thank you. Justin?
Thank you, Mario. Well, I don't really have a question. It's more a suggestion. So you mentioned that one of the things that you may do after this research is explore a little bit further the relationship with the built environment. If you want to go into that direction, I think it's worth sharing the work of a former colleague of mine, Madeleine Guyot. Actually, she's a PhD student of Isabelle Thomas, with us today as well. And she's working on a project in a relationship between urban built environment and mental health. And what I think is interesting is that with colleagues from Italy, if I remember well, they have developed a GIS method to characterize the built environment, but emphasizing the perspective of someone who is in the street. So typically the perspective of someone who may have an undirected travel, like a walk or something like that. So maybe I would just paste the copy of the link to the paper in the conversation here, and it may be something that may be interest to you if you want to maybe have some other kind of relationship between the environment and those travels.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Any other questions, suggestions? If not, then we would like to thank Hanah again for her very nice presentation. And I want to point you to the next week BIVEC-GIBET Transport Research Day. So thank you again, Hanah, for your nice presentation.
Thank you for having me.
And hope to see you all next week at the BIVEC-GIBET Transport Research Days. See you next week.